Welcome back to the ExEm podcast. Here is your host, licensed mental health therapist, Matthew Knabe.
Well, welcome back to the ExEm podcast. If you haven't noticed, it's been a couple weeks since we've been able to put out a new episode. And honestly, it's because we've had some scheduling issues and some shows that I really wanted to do didn't come to fruition. And I don't know if you've noticed, but it seems like things are kind of amping up right now. And whether you're sick or you know somebody who has gotten sick, it just seems like there's a lot of issues with COVID that are going on currently. And that's why I think this episode couldn't have come at a better time. Today we're going to talk about anxiety and the difficulties of navigating life with some of the stressors and fears that we are experiencing in our culture right now. Our guest today shares some personal experiences and gives us his knowledge around leading a congregation through the pandemic. Please welcome to the podcast from City Life Church in Philadelphia, Pastor Brad Leach.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Matthew. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. So what I'd like to do first is just get a little background on you, a little bit of understanding of who you are and maybe what got you into your pastoral role and seeking out ministry.
Yeah, well, I've been in ministry for a little over 20 years now. I actually started...
when you were 5.
Yeah. I look younger than I am. Thank you very much. But I started a church just outside of Detroit where I grew up back in 2001, the Sunday after 9/11, actually.
Wow.
And was there for 8.5 years, mostly single. Met my wife about 6 years into that church plant, and we got married and had our first baby, and then kind of started feeling like a change might be coming and a pull from the Lord really to start another church in the heart of one of America's major cities. And ultimately that led us to Philadelphia. And so we have been there now for 10 years. Been married to Leah for 13 years, and we have 4 kids that are full of energy.
Talk to me a little bit about the last year and a half. First half, maybe as a father. We'll get into the pastoral part, but talk to me a little bit, having 4 kids with a lot of energy. What is that like?
Well, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is we took all that energy and bottled it up in our house and didn't let them leave, for several months.
Yeah.
And so virtual school, that was a new reality for Leah and I. We love each other. But take 6 people, no matter how much they love each other, put them in the same house without anybody leaving or going anywhere. That's for several months. And it was an experience, but our kids, man, they've hung in there, and we're looking forward to in-person school hopefully coming up here in a few months.
Yeah.
Man, had to learn how to communicate in a new way. And one of the challenges practically, even, as I think about mental health, Sabbath has always been such a big part of my life and rhythm. And it just became a season where, I'm a little bit more introverted.
Yeah. That
even on a Sabbath, there's nowhere to go and nowhere really to be by myself.
Yeah.
And learning to kind of just find, peace, rest in a new season, in a new way was a stretch.
It's so interesting. My wife is a classic extrovert. I'm the introvert, and you're right. Like, she needed the people, like her girlfriends, and we weren't seeing them.
Yeah.
And I needed space, but there is no space now. It's like the whole house is occupied. It was like, I keep saying this, and I've said it multiple times. It's like, whatever your household looked like in 2019, it either got stronger or it got worse, but it didn't stay the same. You had to navigate things and learn from that. And I think from my perspective as a mental health therapist, marriage was one of the biggest things that I saw that really was impacted. I think a lot of people got stronger in their faith and stronger in their marriages. But then I'm also counseling people who I would have told you 2 years ago, they're never going to get divorced. And here I'm working with them through divorce. It's just really, really different. What are some of the things as a pastor that you noticed?
As a pastor, I think the isolation, the disconnection, it just goes against the grain of who we're called to be and what we're called to do.
Yeah.
And trying to create community for people who needed it more than ever. without physical touch was a challenge. And then you add into that the tension that we walked through, in a city with a lot of protests, rioting, racial tension, the political polarization, all that we dealt with, as a society, and the church exists as a city within that city. Doing that in the context of that isolation, it was incredibly taxing emotionally, physically, spiritually.
Let me ask you this. How do you think it affected you, counseling? And man, I just got all kinds of all over the place experiences. How did you navigate that?
Well, I think my first reaction to COVID probably was aligned with my personality. And that was, oh man, here's a chance to change the world. This is once in a lifetime. Can you believe, God chose me to live through this? And I basically, kind of rose up and decided, we're going to conquer COVID and reinvent the church. And that was my response for a few weeks. And then I think as it settled in that this is gonna last for a little while. And this is probably not the season where we're gonna take all the hills. And I kind of really crashed from some of that and came into a much darker place of just wrestling to surrender to the season. And I found myself, internally especially, probably saying the right things externally as a leader, but internally just kind of rebelling against really what the season was calling for. And I didn't experience peace until I was able to surrender my expectations of what the church should be, what ministry should look like, to whatever it is God, was up to in the season. And so a lot of that, I think, in the midst of the wrestling, for me, demonstrated itself in anxiety. Experienced a lot of anxiety and learned a lot about myself, how my body manifests anxiety. I never really had considered myself an anxious person before that, but realized that I have dealt with it and do deal with it at a much deeper degree than I ever realized before. And learning some of those signals, I think, is something God's been doing in me and teaching me.
I appreciate you saying that, because I think it's important that I call it the island effect. Hearing another pastor go, you know what? I felt some anxiety last year. It's like we weren't created to not experience some of these things. And I think a lot of times, pastors or people in leadership look at that as potentially a weakness. But I think there's a truth. Like, I've got 60 to 70 clients on my roster. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I have a 3.5-year-old little girl, and my anxiety was through the roof. And I would have clients ask me, my anxiety's high. And I'm like, well, the stimulus is through the roof. My anxiety is through the roof too, and I'm your therapist. So we've got to figure this out together, because a lot of times, we don't have answers for things that we've never experienced. And anxiety to me is kind of the alarm clock or the warning system of the body going, hey, we're about to freak out. Should we freak out or should we not freak out? And when you don't have an answer for that question, maybe you should. I don't know what a pandemic's like. What would you say to somebody that maybe is still experiencing some of those feelings? Maybe somebody who's a leader, maybe somebody who's pastoring a church where there's so many different pressures that are hitting you from so many angles.
Well, I think the first thing I had to recognize was how my body does manifest anxiety, because I couldn't deal with it until I realized I had to deal with it. Until I realized it was even an issue. And I think for me, I like to be in control, or feel like I have a sense of control. And when we were in a season where everything was out of my control, it was just total inability to make a plan for anything. Everything was changing so quickly. I realized anxiety for me manifests in trying to gain control of uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity in my mind. One of the biggest tip-offs to me now is when I find my mind is racing and I can't turn it off, and whatever is the problem I'm trying to solve, I'm just obsessing over it and rolling it over and over and over and over again around in my mind. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, bad dreams, wandering around the house, looking for, trying different couches, going into our guest room, trying to find a place, a position I could fall asleep in.
Yeah.
You know, I recognized just like when the weight would kind of press down on my shoulders. Things that in the past, you know, probably just felt like adrenaline, and man, this is the time to just kind of dial in and, you know, with tenacity and grit, figure something out. I started to recognize, no, this is actually my body manifesting anxiety, and starting to recognize those signs now has given me the ability to pause.
Yeah.
And try to figure out, what am I doing right now in my own strength outside of my relationship with God?
Yeah.
Trying to control something that, you know, the only answer to this might be surrender and trust.
Yeah. So when you find those things, because that's so important that we recognize the body is constantly communicating to us. Oftentimes with clients, I'll say, where are you noticing that? Where is that coming from? What do you think your body's trying to tell you? When you notice those triggers come up and those things happen, what then have you learned that is helpful for you to do with that? Because one thing is to recognize it. Yep, I feel it. But now what do I do with it?
I think I've had to reflect on some very specific questions to identify what exactly I am feeling. Mm-hmm. Because I think by personality, I don't tend to be in touch with my interior world that much. And so I have had to learn how to get within myself and identify what's happening on the inside. So as simple as... you know, Pastor Pete Scazzaro has a little exercise he teaches called Beneath the Iceberg.
Yeah.
And it's just sitting down, you know, with a journal and asking the questions, what am I afraid of?
Yeah.
What am I anxious about? What am I happy about? Which, ironically, is probably the hardest one sometimes for me to answer. Some very specific, what am I angry about? Yeah. I found that one can really... unsurface some things for me, because anger tends to be, I think, a real surface emotion for me that is covering some deeper emotions. Yeah. So just answering, you know, some of those questions in the moment. Okay, why is this creating so much pressure, this situation for me? You know, what's the thing on the other side of it that I'm afraid of that I can now, in a very specific way, turn over to the Lord. You know, answering some of those questions at times during the pandemic, what it did was unearth some losses that I had experienced, some expectations I had for our church and for ministry that had become a disillusion, you know, a lot of disillusionment. And that led to just identifying it gave me the opportunity then to grieve those losses. And so
good. That's good. I know when clients will come into my office and they'll be like, I have a lot of anxiety for this. I'm like, well, what's the question? And they'll do that, and I'll go, what's the answer? And they look at me like, I'm like, you got to answer the question. You got to look underneath. I love the iceberg thing, because there's so many things underneath that are driving what's happening on the above, and a lot of it comes down to self-awareness and being able to ask those questions. Because a lot of times I think people get to my office because they're like, I can't connect those dots. I don't know how to. But it's amazing how many times I've got a client to go, I'm feeling this anxiety and I don't know why, and then we go through a process and they're like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah. And then the anxiety goes, it's like a decompression.
That's right. One of the things I've had to learn is that unprocessed emotions don't go away. They just get buried alive.
That's right.
And then they resurface.
Yeah. And so usually worse.
Yeah, they resurface, you know, physiologically in my body. Mm-hmm. They resurface, you know, can't sleep, you know, wandering around in the night, whatever it might be. And then they resurface relationally. Yeah. You know, I found myself getting impatient with my kids, you know, with Leah, with our staff, with teammates that I love, you know, getting sarcastic, getting defensive. Those things, you know, I've learned oftentimes are connected to deeper things, you know, beneath the iceberg in my heart that I've just been unaware of.
But when that's so good, man. When we address these things, that's like the massive first step. And I look at the beginning of Genesis, and we look at these two, Adam and Eve, who a couple verses before didn't even know what sin was. They follow through a sin, and the first thing they do is avoid. Yeah. It's like it's ingrained in us. Yeah. I have a 3.5-year-old that I guarantee you my wife and I never sat down to teach her how to lie and avoid. She just knows it. You know, Adam and Eve had no idea what sin was, and it's like, oh, we're going to hide from We're in complete communion with him. He's walking around the garden. We're going to hide. But we do that with our emotions. And the problem is they become this monster that we avoid and we avoid and we avoid. I use the snowball. If you're at the top of the mountain, we want to avoid the snowball. The longer and longer you go, this problem gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually it's going to crush you. We've got to turn around and face it.
Yeah.
Yesterday you spoke. I'd like you to just share just a little bit about your topic and what you're speaking on, because I think it was so apropos to what we're talking about today.
Yeah. Well, I brought a little bit of Philly into it, and talked about Rocky.
Yeah.
Everybody's favorite underdog.
Yeah.
But what Rocky did best is he knew how to take a beating. And get back up.
That's right.
And, he never was the biggest guy in the ring, but he had the most grit, the most perseverance, and, was never, even when it looked like he was down for the count, was able to get back up. And, leaders, spiritual leaders over the last 17 months have taken a beating.
Yeah.
And I think something that's going to really point to our ability to bear fruit, just in a post-pandemic context, is going to be the ability to develop the emotional stamina to live in the midst of tension, lead without affirmation. We're in a polarized culture that's probably not going away.
Yeah.
The harsh tone around us, the emotional conversations that leadership requires today, that's not going away.
Yeah.
And so to be able to kind of live in the ring in the midst of the fight, where when you're taking punches from the left, you're taking punches from the right, you're taking punches from every side, to be able to stay in the ring. That was kind of the heart of the message yesterday. And use the picture of Paul in Acts 14. Came into Lystra, the crowd got stirred up, some Jews incited a riot, stoned him, took him outside the city, left him for dead. Some scholars think he was dead and that God raised him from the dead, but what we know for sure is that if he wasn't dead, he looked like he was. If he was breathing, he was barely breathing. Yet some believers got around him, prayed for him, God healed him. Mm-hmm. He got back up and then walked right back into Lystra, which, I look at him, I'm like, man, that's a gangster right there. Like, that's awkward, to go back and face the tension, face the people that just beat you up and left you for dead. And I think one of the things in this culture now, like, we got to get a little more comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And we're living, a lot of us now, in zip codes, neighborhoods, communities that don't necessarily feel like safe places all the time anymore. But being able to just receive God's healing. And one of the things in that story that I love is that these guys, these believers, whoever they were, gathered around him, laid their hands on him, and he looked like a mess.
Sure.
He's just been beaten, stoned, he's bloody, left for dead. And I think a lot of leaders probably look like a mess right now. If we could open up hearts and get a real look at what's going on inside, like it might not be pretty.
Yeah.
But to let some people in, there's still I think around every leader who may be struggling right now, there's a group of friends that would love to get in the ring, pour their faith out just for healing, for wholeness, again.
Man, there's not a better time for messages like that. I mean, it's about as poignant and time sensitive as possible. I just think it has been such an interesting time to lead people as pastors, to lead in the ministry in the church. Because we are divided. I think you used the word divisive a little bit ago, and our culture's been divisive for a long time. But the church, I haven't seen it quite like this. I mean, there's been something else that has come, and I think a lot of times, and I've had this conversation in a couple of our podcasts this week, of there's a couple different directions we can go. And I think it's important that we recognize that there are some really great things that can come out of a time that we experience. There are things that we can renew. There are things that can be redeemed. But we got to stop. We got to start listening to each other. We got to start being kind to each other. We got to start understanding each other. I think that's a big block that a lot of people are experiencing, because they just want their perspective to be heard.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to share with our audience? Anything on your heart, your mind that you feel like would be good parting words for us today?
One other thing I said yesterday that comes back to mind right now is that part of what we've been through, it's a perfect storm, because isolation plus pressure plus cultural acceptance equals sin and shame.
Amen.
And even back to what you were saying earlier about Adam and Eve in the garden, where does that propensity to hide come from? It's the shame that we feel that's so innate to human nature. Mm-hmm. Just terrified of nakedness, vulnerability, being exposed, as frauds. Yeah. And I think the only way we're going to be able to survive today, and not only survive, but thrive and be healthy and whole, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically, is to break the pattern of isolation that's so ingrained itself around us these last 15, 16, 17 months, and really create community. And it's, community is a buzzword that we talk a lot about as spiritual leaders, but to all the leaders who are listening to this, only if you truly have it in your life. And just to encourage, those who are listening to this podcast, do whatever you need to do, to develop real, meaningful, genuine, vulnerable relationships that'll, prevent that isolation from building steam in your heart.
It's good. I'm not going to end the podcast right here, because it popped right back in my mind. You have a connection with Emerge Ministries. Yeah. And I would be remiss if we didn't at least dive into that. Talk to me a little bit about your connection with Emerge.
Yeah, Leah and I, we had been married for about a year, and God really started stirring my heart initially toward a change that ultimately led us from Michigan to Philadelphia to plant City Life. But Leah, we had just been married, just had our first baby. She was kind of nesting, and she was not thinking about a change of that magnitude, and going into a church doesn't exist. There's no salary, health insurance. Like, those are things that as a newly married couple you think about. So we actually went to Emerge for 3 days, and our thinking was to kind of process the decision, with somebody. But what ended up, and that did happen, but what ended up happening that was even better, and what we maybe weren't expecting, was we were able to early on in our marriage just kind of learn some skills for talking with each other, communicating with each other. I learned a lot more about her. She learned a lot more about me. We were able to take some assessments that just brought a lot of self-discovery and self-awareness for each of us. And I think what it did is it laid a foundation for our marriage that's been really important, the last 11, 12 years since then.
I love that, man. That's just good. It's good to hear that, because, what we do as a ministry is we try to provide a service for so many people that don't have access to places like Emerge. There are other Christian facilities, but there's just not a lot. There's not a lot of places, and the fact that Emerge has been able to make an impact on your marriage and your ministry, because your marriage is so important to ministry,
Yeah, I'm grateful for it, and just would encourage everybody who's listening, find the help that you need, and if you don't know where to turn, Emerge is the place to be.
Awesome. Man, thank you so much for your time. I know you're crazy busy, and I know this whole couple days is a whirlwind, but carving out some time to spend with me really means a lot. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the invitation.
What a great guy and brother in Christ. I really appreciate Pastor Brad and the time he spent talking with me, not only about his connection with Emerge Ministries, but also the discussion we had around anxiety and the overwhelming aspects of what all of us are feeling right now in our culture. Here's my takeaway from the episode today. Stop avoiding the stressors, meaning we have to face our fears, anxieties, and worries. This is what it means to face the adversities in our life versus avoiding them. Sometimes we need to reach out to start that process, and if you feel like it's time for you to meet with a therapist, then take the first step and reach out to the resources in your area. If you need more information about Emerge, go to emerge.org right now. Thank you for listening, and please share this episode along with any other episode to anybody that you feel like might be on your heart that needs to hear more about these topics. Well, until next time, or when our Savior comes, God bless.